if you've heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found, or the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. I should have enlarged that map. I'm sorry I didn't. This is a Google map. But the town of Enid is here. And this is the canyon that we walk up to go to the waterfalls of David. We've shown those slides before where the waterfalls and pools are. Well, there's another huge valley here that's almost like a Grand Canyon. I mean, it's got all kinds of arms and stuff. The cave is way, 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 way back here. Long. It's hard to get to. Very, very difficult to get to, called the Cave of Horrors. And they found fragments and things in there. We now have, here's kind of the placement of it, the Dead Sea, and then Enid. And here you can see it. Can you see a little dark line right there? See, that's greenery where the river runs. That's where the waterfalls and the river runs, and so it's all green down in the bottom. And you cannot believe walking in 110-degree heat at the Dead Sea and then going up that valley and it drops to like 89. You know, it's still hot, but it's so refreshing and so cooling, and the water is still about 60. You know, it's very cold because it comes out of a spring. But this is where it's at. It's down near the southern part of the valley, and is on a promontory point there. This is what it looks like from the road. I was able to find the valley from the road, and when we're driving through that little notch right back there, and you can see there's no highway back there. In fact, there's mainly hiking trails back there. There's not even Jeep trails and four-wheel roads. I've actually found a drone shot of the valley. I'm always looking. There's new and more libraries of drone shots getting out there, and this is the actual valley, and the cave is in this area right here. It's in that promontory point where they found them. But this is what the Judean Wilderness looks like. This is where Jesus was for 40 days, was tempted. It's just inhospitable. And then the Dead Sea is over on the right side there, you can see. But it's just up and it's down. And it's nothing grows. Nothing grows. You can't find scrub this tall to crawl underneath for shade. It just doesn't grow there. This is a shot across the valley of the Cave of Horrors, where it was actually found. You can see that there's no real way to get there. They have to rappel to get to this place. And they have built a fence in this area. They've built a fence and a secondary fence in case anybody falls. I don't think the fence would stop me, I'm afraid, you know, but it may. But anyway, here they are rappelling too, and you can see their packs and stuff up above, and they're going down to the Cave of Horrors. That's a person. That's an individual there, okay? So little teeny tiny folks. Here's some of the crew that's there. This is a part of a new program that Israel has where they're taking Israeli teenagers who are going into the military, but they're not old enough to be in the military yet, so they let them do some of their service in archaeology or management, wildlife management, and stuff like that. And so actually, when they go into the Army, they have an elevated status if they've done this. It's kind of like ROTC, you know. Gives them a little bit of an elevated status. But these are all teenagers who have rappelled to this cave and are working in it. And it's kind of cramped. It's cramped quarters. It's hot. It's dusty. And then you have to sift sand. Now, you are looking across the canyon at the other canyon wall over there. And they've got the dirt buckets, and they put them in the sifters, and they throw them back and forth on ropes. And then the sand falls through, and the big pieces are left, and then you look for bone, you look for pottery, you look for arrowheads and things like that that are left in these screens, these basically screen windows that you shake. Not a lot of room to move, as you can see. But look at all of the pots that are broken in there. Can you see all of these white pieces that are pieces of pottery? This is all broken pots back here, shards. And this is, the pottery that you're looking at is late Roman. This is about 200, 400 AD. This is not the time of Christ. It's a couple hundred years later. in this white ceramic that the Romans and the Middle East used about 300 AD. This is what the fragments look like. Okay, there's not a boatload of them. This is not like the original Dead Sea Scrolls where we found whole scrolls and parts of scrolls and portions of books. These are literally fragments, which tells us that looters have been here. And those scrolls are floating around somewhere, probably in the black market. And so they're being sold to collectors who will never see the light of day. And they just left the pieces behind, okay, but did not take that. So when we lay them out, it's a whole lot of fuss for a whole lot of little, but it is more remnants of the Essenian community and their writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What we find are pieces of all of the 12 minor prophets. There's references from all of the 12 minor prophets from this in the writing. What makes this stand out a little differently from the Dead Sea Scrolls of the 50s is all of these are in Greek rather than Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls were 90% Hebrew and about 8%, 10% Greek. These are all Greek. These are all written in Greek. And only one little piece of parchment was found. This piece is only about this big. It's only about 5 inches long. And it has nothing written on it because it was parchment that was being prepared or dried to write on. It is animal skin, and it has to dry for about a year before they can use it. And so this was rolled up, put in a cave to dry, and then they're going to come back later and be able to write on top of it. But nobody came back and got it. So that's the only thing that looks like a scroll that was actually found. When all the pieces were dried and put out, or repaired and put out, this is about how much it was. It's about 11 by 14 frame, holds all of the fragments, but every one of them has enough reference that we can tell what book they came from. They've got 3 and 4 lines of writing on them, so that's what one of them looks like close up. You see how small the writing is? I mean, this is a piece about this big. So it's micro writing, okay? This is the microfiche version of the Essenes. But yeah, they wrote in very, very small but very beautiful Greek, using dental picks and things to take the pieces apart and to work with them. Very, very delicate work. Also, a cache of coins was found from about 300 AD, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Once Israel had fallen and they'd been dispersed, a remaining group of Jews gathered under the leadership of a family, and they led the revolt against Rome for one last time. It was incredibly unsuccessful, unsuccessful. But the thing about these coins is they almost look uncirculated. I mean, these were taken from the mint and from the town and hidden. And they weren't taken from the store where they got worn down and dirty. These things look new, which means bronze. Most all of these are bronze. Yeah, they're stamped bronze. Good question. At this time, the metal was what it was worth in weight. And so the coin could be varying sizes, and that's why you had to be very careful about weighing your coins. When gold was being used for coins, they would stamp it or they would pour it, and there would be a little rough edge around it, like a pancake with a little lace around the edge of it or something like that. And unscrupulous people would clip that off. They'd get little shears and knife and cut it off and then keep it and collect it, and then they'd turn the gold in. But your coin now is worth only 9/10 of what it's supposed to be because you took some of the gold off. You shaved the gold around the edges. So they had to weigh the gold coins. They couldn't just say, well, that's one gold coin, because it may have been altered and shaved down. Bronze, not so much, but it's, those are all bronze coins. And the palm tree was the sign of the revolution. The Judean palm, date palm, was a sign of the Bar Kokhba revolution. Then, as they're digging, 2 teenagers find some rope. And they begin to brush the rope, and the rope becomes long. And the rope becomes thick, and the rope becomes heavy. And what they found is a basket. They have unearthed a basket. Well, when you're only seeing this much of it, you go, cool beans. We found a piece of a basket. This is really neat. And they kept excavating, and they found out it was in a complete whole basket. Now, the material that the basket is made out of does not always give an accurate carbon dating. They admit that. The Israeli government admits that it doesn't always give an accurate dating. But right now, the dating of this thing, they say, is 10,600 years old. I don't think the world is that old, but, so I think that the carbon dating is off. But right now, it's probably the oldest intact basket that has ever been found on the planet. We do believe that. It's the oldest intact, and because of the dryness of the desert, it had a chance to survive and not rot and not get wet and not get moisture. And so it is intact, but it's a big basket. I believe it was probably a burial basket. I believe it was probably a burial for a child. And probably the child, and they found the basket. Looters in years past have found it and taken the child and sold it. Probably to the French or to the British, who put those kind of things, they're mummy collectors. You go to the French and the British Museum, and there are all these mummies that were purchased from Egypt and all around the world. And so they were very big on that. We've even talked about in class, here in church, how they would take ground mummy and eat it and drink it because they thought it was a potion and that it would give them virility and strength. And so there were ads in the London paper where you could purchase mummy powder. And you could purchase a mummy finger and grind it yourself to show that it was authentic. So I think they're going to find out it was probably a burial basket, because they did find a 6-year-old girl buried in this same cave. Here's the basket after it's been cleaned up a little bit, and in the conservator's office, they're actually preserving it. They're injecting it and cleaning it and brushing it off, and then they'll coat it with a material that will preserve it. A comb. This is actually a lice comb for combing out lice and things like that, and it hadn't changed a lot through the years. You can see the size of it in the palm of the hand. This is the time of Christ. This is an early Roman comb, and very indicative of that time. Some arrowheads. The arrowheads range anywhere from about 400 BC to 400 AD. So these caves were used, 800 years to hide out and to fight and do battle in. If you look at the Dead Sea, Qumran is way up near the top, and this is in the valley of Nahal Haver, and that's about a 25-mile drive. It's about 25 miles. The Dead Sea is about 30 miles long, so, you can look at it and say, yeah, it's just about the whole 30 miles from Qumran. But every one of those yellow words is where we have found scrolls. We have found scrolls in every one of those places. Those are where they were found, all up and down that hillside. I've shown you pictures how the mountains just go like this and then drop to the Dead Sea, because it is a crack in the ground. And so all along there are caves and things where they are hidden. There's a close-up of where Jerusalem is, where Herodium is, where Qumran is at. Jericho is just above the D in the top wadi there, and just below the D of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so you would find Jericho there. Down at the south, Masada and Nahal Haver is very, very close to the hole where the Cave of Horrors is at.
Another one's getting out. He's dusting himself off. He's getting dressed. For years, we chased after antiquities looters. We finally decided to preempt the thieves and try reaching the artifacts before they're removed from the ground in the caves. The high cliffs of 300 to 400 meters in a single drop, with these enigmatic ravines that no one reaches, were the ultimate haven. And in one period of human history, families fled to the caves in the Judean desert, and we really don't know anything else. Therefore, it's of paramount importance.
They planned what they will be taking from home ahead of time, what they will need to have with them when one day the war will be finished, what they will be able to use to build a new life. We come here and reconstruct the life of those who didn't survive in the end.
To enter the first time a cave in which Bar Kokhba's fighters sat, to know that you're the first to come in there since then, it blows your mind.
Amir from the cave, you hear me?
I hear you.
Come quickly, we've discovered amazing things.
Really? What'd you find?
Parchment fragments, it's amazing here.
We found approximately 20 parchment fragments with Greek writing.
We're excavating fragments that no human hand has touched in 2,000 years, and presto, they have landed on our desk. The fragments found are part of the biblical composition of the 12 prophets, books found in the Hebrew Bible.
We're excavating in the Cave of Horror, and we uncovered a skull and skeleton in an exceptional state of preservation. This is the body of a boy or a girl. You can tell by the length of the legs, which are very short. You can even see the remnants of hair and a bit of skin.
What's amazing is that we're not dealing with just a skeleton, but essentially with a mummy that was buried this way over 6,000 years ago. Whoever buried this mummy wrapped it in cloth like a blanket from the sides, and that is how we found it.
There's a huge basket there. A complete basket round. The basket before us is 10,000 years old. Even today, we have very few complete baskets, and this is one of the biggest, and it is exquisitely beautiful. It will apparently teach us other things about the people who settled here in this cave.
The Israel Antiquities Authority considers it important to bring youth before their army service here to dig for the artifacts with their own hands.
I'm very happy to be here. I feel that this way I connect to our heritage, to our history, to the nation. It's something you always see in museums, and then you are the one who's contributing to the process, so it's cool.
We are responsible for the security of these cultural assets, for ensuring that they reach the right places in the right way. From now on and for centuries to come, if someone will want to ask a question, they'll know where to look.
Let's talk about our study, which is Jesus the Rabbi. What does it take to be a rabbi at the time of Jesus? What did it take? What was the educational system, okay? In our last and final night, we'll look at what have we learned and how does it parallel with what we know about Jesus in the gospel. Can we actually find remnants and references to his educational system in the gospels? And I think we can, okay? So tonight we start with what the Mishnah says about education. We looked at the difference last week between Greek and Hebrew education and thought. And so they said at 5, you're fit for Scripture. At 5, you should start to read and memorize Scripture. At 10, you're ready to learn the Mishnah, which is the oral traditions and the interpretations of the Torah. And so 5 is for the reading of the Scriptures. 10 is the interpretation of the Scriptures. At 13, you fulfill the commandments. This is the bar mitzvah, the son of the law. And it's time now that you begin to live as a man. You're responsible to the law. It's what we would call age of accountability in Christian circles, that before that time you're not accountable for your sins because you don't know what repentance and sin is. But there comes that time, and the bar mitzvah is that time, okay? At 18, it's time to get married. Most men should be married by the age of 18. And then at 20, you should have a job. You should have a vocation. You should have your mentorship completely finished and be working in your position. And then at age 30, you should have authority. You should have your own business, your own company, your own store. If you're a teacher, you should be teaching your own lessons and stuff, okay? So that's the authority time. The first school that a child goes to is called Bet Sefer. Bet Sefer is the beginning school, And it literally means the book, the house of the book. Okay, Bet means house. Bethlehem, the house of bread. And so Bet means the house of the book, or the Torah. And this was the 5 to 10-year-old, and both boys and girls went at the time of Jesus. Both were made to go in 5 to 10. Each synagogue and each town had their own local Torah teachers. Sometimes they were rotated, and sometimes they circulated. Sometimes they only had one teacher, and they fed him and gave him a home and kind of took care of him like we would a pastor or something like that. But he was the local school teacher, the Torah teacher. They always began with the book of Leviticus. Now, how's that for exciting reading? Boy, I mean, we want to get new Christians hooked with John because it's exciting, but let's get them hooked up with, look forward to getting through Leviticus. It's Deuteronomy's next. What? So they always began with the book of Leviticus, and they began to memorize the Torah. Now, the teacher incorporated math and science and literature and poetry, but the only textbook that they had was the Torah. I mean, that's all they had. They didn't have textbooks. They all had to memorize the Shema. We've studied that in depth. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. They had to memorize the Shema reading of Deuteronomy. And then they all had to memorize the Genesis 1 through 5 creation story. This was the minimum that was required in their 5th and 6th year. And by the time they were 10, they were expected to have had almost all of the 5 books completely in memory. Now, can you imagine 10-year-olds in our world knowing the first 5 books of the Old Testament by heart? I've told you guys before that when I was at Emmanuel, we began the Emmanuel Christian School. I was there. I was on staff, and I was a part of that whole process. And we were interviewing headmasters from across the country, looking for a good, strong, sturdy Christian headmaster. And the one who got the job, sat across the table from us, and he said, first of all, public schools do nothing to challenge children to learn. He said, it's how many can we get through and get money from the government? That's what the public school system is about. It's about money and the bottom line. He said, if you have me as your headmaster, I do not want to hear any whining. I do not want to hear any crying. I don't want to get complaints from you, because I will expect the children to be memorizing the Bible in the 1st grade. And by the time they graduate from the 6th grade, they will have most of the Gospels memorized. And he did. And he did. We watched it happen, and we heard the complaints, and we heard the whining, and we heard the parents who just couldn't believe how much stress the children were under. And the kids loved it. It was the parents who were stressed, not the kids. They were challenged. And he made it exciting and competitive and fun to be studying that. He was not a perfect person. He had some personality quirks none of us liked. He wasn't like me, in other words. He wasn't perfect, Had he been perfect like me. But he was a great headmaster and did a good job at that school. He really started us out right. And so by age 10, huge parts of the first 5 books are expected to be memorized. The best students who have them all memorized are the ones who are going to be suggested to go on. Those who don't, you may not go on. You may get put to work. You might get put to work instead. Again, as I said, there are no textbooks. And every synagogue usually only had one copy of each of the 5 books. They only had one scroll that might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books in them, and that's all they had. And so children should certainly not be reading them. They couldn't be handling them. Hands on parchment, oils make them rot and destroy quicker. And so all of the memorization was done by oral repetition, oral repetition, oral repetition. The teacher would say it, the children would memorize it. The teacher would say it, the children would memorize it. They didn't have books. It was all by oral repetition. And if one word is wrong, the hammer came down. It had to be letter perfect. And so this was the strictness of the Bet Sefer, okay? The only schooling that the girls received was this first schooling. That Sefer was all they ever got. When they were 10, then it was time to get ready to get married, because they're going to get married when they can physically have children, when that happens. And so they're trained to be a housewife or going to be married off quite soon. But girls did have that first 5-year period of training, okay? Now, there's a really cute story in the Mishnah about parents who took their babies to school the first day. We have all kinds of traditions here in America about first day of school. You might take a picture of your kid, you might walk up to the school, you do something for the first day. They so believed in what they were doing that they would take their little prayer shawls and they would wrap it around them like a mummy and bring them to the teacher and say, "Here is our empty scroll. Write the Torah on it." And it was wrapped around the kid like a scroll. "Here's our empty scroll." And the teacher would say, "Yes, we certainly will." And then the next kid would come, "Here is our empty scroll." Write it, the Torah. "Yes, I will." But every person did that at the time of Jesus. They wrapped their little kids. And so I just imagine Jesus being wrapped in a shawl and taken to the teacher and write the Torah on it, not knowing that he wrote the Torah. Yeah, he gave it. So it's interesting. The second schooling was called Bet Talmud. Bet Talmud, okay? And Bet Talmud is the house of learning. The house of learning. This is when, if you really, really show talent and you show skill in the first 5 years, then most boys progressed on. Most of the boys were pushed on. Ones who just did not have the ability to do, academic work were given a pass and were allowed to go to work as apprentices and helpers. But most of the boys did go on to Bet Talmud. Failure in the school was poor memorization. Passing, we would expand your study. The more you memorize, the more we will expose you to. The more you memorize, the more we'll expose you to. They began to study other books of the Old Testament then. They started studying the prophets, and they started studying the poetry and some of the other books in Bet Talmud. But in the first ruling, the only thing they had was the Torah. They also began to memorize the oral laws, the interpretations. Again, the Pharisees believed that all of the laws were given on Mount Sinai, 600 laws, and only a few of them were written, but the rest of them were oral. And so the ones who weren't written had to be learned at Bet Talmud so that they could be passed on, okay? At the very time of Jesus in Jerusalem, there were 480 synagogues. 480 synagogues in this little tiny provincial city that had both Bet Sefer and Bet Talmud schools. So you didn't have to go far to go to school, right? I mean, it's community schools, basically. 480 synagogues that were recorded as having their dual school system at that time. For most men, this is the last level of education. Could we say that Bet Sefer is like elementary school? And that Bet Talmud is like high school? Okay, it's like high school. And you're going to get more and deeper and better, but now it's time to go be a man and do things, okay? So by 14 or 15 years of age, you should begin to learn a trade, and primarily from your father. Jesus had finished the Bet Talmud. His disciples had already finished this, and they were now learning a trade because as he walked along the seashore, they were mending nets and fishing with their father. Who's their teacher? Their father. And so they are at about this 14 to 15, younger, much younger than 20. We learned that on one of our nuggets, right? That the coin that was in the fish's mouth, the temple tax, was only for a certain age group, so they're all younger. So see how this is all fitting together. You're learning how this whole thing works. But Bet Talmud, and they were learning a trade. Let's look at these verses and we'll call it a night. We won't get on to the third and fourth school, okay? We've taken a little time, and that's great. That's what we're here for. But if you'll look at Matthew 4 with me. Matthew 4, 18 to 22. Now, as Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was also called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, cast in a net into the sea, for they had a trade, right? They had a trade. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately left their nets and followed him. Now that's going to make a lot more sense later when we talk about discipleship, okay? Immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who's son of Zebedee, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately left their boat and their father and followed him. So these are probably 14, 15-year-old boys, 16 at the most, who are bailing out of the boat and saying, "Daddy, we've got a teacher. See you later." And so what are they saying? We want more than Bet Talmud. We want more than Bet Sefer, and we want more than Bet Talmud. And the father was probably incredibly pleased, because we will find out later that this is not a full-time calling. Being a disciple is not a full-time calling at the time of Christ. Okay? So we'll pick up here. We'll pick up with Matthew next week and go on from there and finish with the next two schools. And we'll look at what was it to follow a teacher. What was it? What was required? What was expected? And then we'll look at the parallels of Christ. And that'll be about it on our study, but you should understand a lot about rabbis by the time we get through.